God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good morning. This morning we continue in our series on marriage, looking at the Song of Solomon. And the topic for this morning is sexuality. The Song of Songs is usually attributed to Solomon. Sometimes it's called the Song of Solomon. And it's remarkably graphic and surprisingly positive in its view of sexuality. Romance is a sacred thing to God because He's ordained that we should have this kind of pleasure in each other as a husband and wife and find our completion in a way that's unique to all other relationships. Now, think of it in the context in which we live. We've never had, I don't think, so much knowledge about sex. I mean, from grade school on. And yet been so incredibly ignorant at the same time about the meaning of it. We live in a sexualized age that the more influences and images and stimulation to sexual desire, we're seeing more frustration, more depression, and less satisfaction. So it's something that's been separated out and marketed. The message of our culture that it's sending to us and receiving about sexuality is an idol. It's the marketing of an idol. And by that, I don't mean little statues that we keep in the garage under a blanket. Nobody worships an idol, but an idol is whatever you love, serve, and obey. An idol is the foundation of your existence, the functional reality that you must have. So anything can be made an idol, and usually we make idols out of good things. I don't think we intentionally look for evil and make that the functional center of our life. But sexuality has become that for our culture. And the assumption behind all of this, and this is what runs our society, is that you and I are defined fundamentally, primarily, by our sexuality. That's who you are. And this is what's behind the debates about homosexuality, heterosexuality, alternative sexuality, is that this defines who you are. That's the message that we get. That idol stands behind all the debates. In the 21st century, we are now firmly in the new Enlightenment, which reduces us to nothing more than a collection of chemicals, biomechanical things that can be adjusted, consumers who are just waiting to be fed and led. And so you see this all around us. Adolescents are told that they are little more than animals to be managed through sex education and the availability of contraceptives. Well, I want to say to our children, our young people, you're not animals. You have free will, value, and dignity as children of God. We see it on the other end of the continuum. Older people are being robbed of the dignity of aging gracefully by a consumer message that, you know what, if you're not sexually active, there's something wrong with you. You belong in those 2 bathtubs. You need to go see Alice. So what was once a crown of glory to be older and less driven by passions and more available for younger people to give mentoring and wisdom. Now seniors are being thrown into the mix. So you too must go out and be sexually active. And nothing's more tragic than the rising statistics of STDs among seniors now. That's becoming a bigger and bigger problem, sexually transmitted diseases. So you come to church and try to live as a Christian and create some kind of a framework to make sense out of all this, and it's not unusual to be confused, angry, afraid. There are so many different things that hitting us about sexuality that we either just tune out or we go the other way, and that becomes counterproductive. We've got questions about sex before marriage. We've got questions about sex in marriage. We've got questions about sex after marriage, homosexuality, dating, courtship, pornography. And under all of this is this loneliness and this desire for the genuine, to want to belong. So now we're in church, and the next point is going to be, so what does God say about sexuality? What's Christian faith say about sexuality? Well, here we run into another problem. Christian culture is not the same as biblical belief. Do you know that? I mean, Christian culture oftentimes is least helpful when it comes to sexuality, because we're known more for what we're against, right, than what we're for. For the most part, you don't see a celebration of sex coming out of the Christian voice in terms of it being fun, fulfilling, good, and connected with God. The other thing that can happen is that marriage in conservative Christianity in America has become an idol. It's been held up for political purposes. Sometimes it is so idealized, it's out of reach for people. And they think, unless you have a perfect marriage, you better not go to church. I mean, if you're having an argument with your wife and it's Sunday morning, where's the last place you want to be? Because we all want to have the best face forward. We don't want to acknowledge sexuality problems or anything like that. And in order for the church to become effective in the 21st century, we need to do a lot of work to be able to freely be able to talk about sexuality, problems and struggles that we have as men and women, so that this is not only a safe place, but it's a place of freedom. So we're going to look at sexuality this morning through God's Word, through the Song of Songs. And there's three things that I want to point to. That God created sex to be beautiful. Secondly, He created sex to be valued. And third, He created sex to be a promise of things to come. So first, God created sex to be beautiful. If you look in your bulletins, the Song of Songs, chapter 4, the first thing we need to do is realize that this is the equivalent of a Hebrew movie. In antiquity, there were no videos, there were no DVDs. So if you wanted to present something in more than a teaching, you visualized sounds, sense, tactile touch, sensuality, and that would come through poetry. The other thing you need to know is that unlike Western poetry, which saves the punchline is at the end, in Hebrew poetry, it's in the middle. So that's where the center of this is. And that's what we find in the Song of Songs in chapter 4. In the opening verses, the man describes his bride, admiring her physical beauty. In verse 1, he says, "You are beautiful, my darling, beautiful beyond words. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil." He uses a variety of images that are very sensual and at the same time seem very strange and alien to us, but very familiar and very complementary in the culture that he's speaking to. He says her eyes are like doves, her lips are like a scarlet ribbon. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twin fawns of a gazelle. And that's very much within the keeping of the art and the literature of the Middle East. So this verse calls attention to the primary message of the book. It's all about the glorification of the human body, about sexuality in all of its depth, and there's a sense of mystery about it. Many Bible readers in the early church just could not handle this. And so what you find is you start to have an allegorical meaning assigned to this. And people would say, well, the Song of Songs can't possibly be about what it looks like it's about. They could not imagine that the Holy Spirit of God would be integrally involved in sensuality and sexuality. So they came up with all kinds of explanations, that this really wasn't what it was saying. But if you look at it, it just is relentless in talking about this in a very sensual way. Until the day breaks and the shadows flee, I'll go to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of incense. I mean, that's sexual. That's talking about a woman. He's looking forward to loving his bride all night long. It's beautiful. And the message of the book is that sex between a married man and a woman is beautiful. And it's beautiful because it's found inside of something else. It's found inside of this covenant of marriage. So why do we squirm when we read it in church and we kind of giggle and, oh, boy, that's kind of funny, It's because for so long the church has, as it became more institutionalized, saw marital sex more as a necessary evil in order to try to fit it in with its theology. And so you have all these kind of crazy interpretations that, the reference to a woman's breast, obviously this is talking about the Old and New Testaments. Except for there was no New Testament then, right? Another one was, well, this can't be about a woman's breast. This must be the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. That this is a high lifted up thing. And it's kind of, and celibacy begins more and more as you go through the Middle Ages to be elevated to the highest virtue over marriage, over sexuality, and you get the birth of the celibate priesthood. So we don't have a great track record. Even from the earliest times. The church struggles with sexuality. A Christian man once commented, he said, I have to keep God and sex separate. I can't be in my God mode at the same time that I'm in my sex mode. I have to switch back and forth from those. I just can't negotiate that together. And you see, that's the task for the 21st century Christian church, is to bring back what God's joined together. This internal dissonance that we have in church about sexuality is why you hear about sex everywhere but in church. And what happens when you hear nothing about something for a prolonged time? It's something to be ashamed of. It's something you don't talk about, right? Over time, people as human beings just start to pick up the message. If we're not talking about it, it must be bad, right? So we haven't done a great job with that. Human sexuality starts with God's intent. It's something that is beyond just the chemical releases and the thrills of orgasms and the delight in being close to each other. There is a deep, mystical meaning even beneath that in terms of sexuality. It's what St. Paul describes in Ephesians 5:31. You've probably heard this before. He says, as the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. This is a great mystery, but it is an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one. And you know how we're always talking about we're living in the already but the not yet? We're living in between the fulfillment of the kingdom, our resurrection physically in the new heaven and the new earth. Marriage and sexuality are all pointing that way. In our culture and in religious groups and political groups, there's this endless debate about the legitimacy of alternative sexuality. And nobody ever wins that argument, right? I mean, it just goes around in circles and it quickly gets wrapped around the axle and all kinds of hard feelings and injustice and all this stuff. But God has clearly told us what this is all about right from the beginning in a way that defies reason. He's given it to us in HD clarity in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 2:23. Let me just set the setting. God has created man. So Adam's there. He doesn't know there's even such thing as a woman. He's got creative work. He's got stuff to do. Every day is better than the last day. He gets to name plants and play with animals and tend the garden, do all kinds of stuff, and he's with God, and they love each other. But even then, something's missing, and you can tell this by the reaction when God creates woman. And he says this in verse 23. "At last," the man exclaimed, "this is one who is bone from my bone, flesh from my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken from man." And then there's this commentary. "This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Now the man and his wife were both naked and felt no shame." Now, it's easy to kind of skate over those verses and think, well, there's that, and then there's this commentary, and then they're joined into one, and then they're not ashamed. Oh, well, wonder who's going to win the Super Bowl. Profound. I didn't know this existed. I didn't know there could be this kind of oneness. It's like the oneness he's got with God, but it's like the oneness he doesn't even know he's going to have someday in the kingdom. We'll talk about that at the end here. Marriage is a covenant where a man and a woman can be naked emotionally, naked physically, and be one. And it's just a shadow of the oneness we're going to have with Christ as his bride. There's a limit to how much you can describe this. That's why Paul says this is a mystery. At the heart of it, we're going to bump up against a limitation in our understanding, but something so wonderful, a oneness that is going to overcome your and my alienation, sense of loneliness, that is once and for all going to be more beautiful than we can imagine. And when it happens, we're going to go, at last, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. That's where we're going. That's the new heaven and the new earth. That's what this table represents, is that great wedding feast. So marriage is a covenant to preserve something that's been entrusted to us as Christians, something that is a gift to the world that is really in a tailspin over these things. So in a very real way, it's the marriage that keeps the love alive. It's the marriage that keeps the sex alive. Now what we hear outside is just the opposite. It's the sex that keeps the marriage alive, right? But that's not true. So second, God created sex to be valued, to be looked at as something worth waiting for. Notice in the Song of Songs in verse 8, the lover refers to his woman as my bride. Up till now they've been courting. Now it's the actual wedding date. He's looking at her for the first time through this veil. This is a transitional point in the relationship. One of the basic signs of the development of a child into maturity is the ability to delay what? Gratification. Yeah, that's one of the first signs that you're beginning to mature. We live in an infantile culture. You know? Nobody can wait for anything, and we're told you shouldn't wait for anything. You should eat as much as you can today. Drink as much as you can. You should have as much sex as you can for as long as you can. And even if you can't, you should find a way to keep having sex. You know, there should be no space between what you want and waiting for it. And yet God is saying the path to fulfillment is exactly this. They've been looking forward to sexual intimacy, and the promise is about to be fulfilled. And that's what we read here. Now, on an on-the-street interview, people were asked what the difference between love and sex was. And some of the answers were like this. Love is something you feel. Sex is something you do. Right? So you don't have to be in love with someone to have sex with them. Is that true? You know, we have uncritically swallowed everything we've been fed. You know? And we kind of live this dual life. We believe things as Christians, but in the world we believe things out there. We need to develop the critical faculties to be able to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure the assumption behind what's being peddled to me is at all true. And then we need to talk about that with each other and talk about that with our kids. At least ask the questions. Is this true? Engagement has a purpose that's largely been lost in our culture. How do people get attracted to each other? Do they just walk up like two magnets and copulate? Do they just, let's have sex, No, you see someone, primarily men are sight-oriented. Women are drawn by emotional things, and you're attracted to each other. And then what happens? There's this thrill of discovery, and you want to spend time with each other. You start discovering things that you have in common. It's just like huge, And then you discover ways that you complement each other. An introvert finds sanctuary in an extrovert. They go to parties, and wow, I'm not alone anymore standing in the corner with this person. This is cool. And all these things happen until you develop as soulmates. And then you consummate that in a sexual relationship. And for Christians, for biblical Christians, that's in a covenant marriage. What's happening in our day with sex before marriage and all of the excuses for it is all of that gets short-circuited. Do you know what the number one crisis in marriages is today for Christians as well as non-Christians? It's a crisis of intimacy, not sex. There's, where the communication gaps, we don't understand each other, we don't talk each other, all we do is fight. Where's that come from? It comes because 9 times out of 10, it was short-circuited. Why do people have affairs outside of marriage? Many times with people who are comparatively not all that attractive. It's because they become soulmates at the water cooler. They've worked together and they've developed a relationship and a communication, a safety with each other that's missing in the marriage. And then it turns into a sexual relationship, but it's not always sex first, you see? So if we short-circuit the purposes of intimacy and soul-to-soul coming together by having sex before that, it becomes later on a crisis of intimacy. That's what engagement is all about. Now, people have said, well, you know what? You need to have sex before you make a commitment of marriage or even moving in, because you got to know if you're compatible, right? Well, all sex does at that point is it minimizes and it masks the weaknesses in the relationship, because you never get to talk about it, right? You just go right into a sexual relationship. That becomes very shallow because there's no intimacy to support it. I mean, by that logic, if you want to really communicate with somebody who you're attracted to, you should both get roaring drunk. It's the same thing. It just masks all your judgment. And not only that, the next day you can't remember what you said. So that's the fallacy and the lunacy of the culture that we live in. And we need to be able to talk about this with people and be able to present our case and be able to present sexuality in a joyful way that is winsome to people and invites them into it. Not just say, look, you just shouldn't have sex before marriage. We've got to do better than that. When kids in school say, well, everybody's having sex, you know what? Everybody's not having sex. There are plenty of kids, statistically, at least half the kids in Hearn and High and Chantilly are not having sex. They're not animals. They do have a respect for themselves. So first, guard your body. Make a commitment to value sex. Write it down. Make a promise to your friends. Guard your mind by what goes into it. You know, when Jesus said, you know, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off in your eye. You know, look at the things around you that are militating against God's view of sensuality and sexuality. Not everybody should have an iPad. Not everyone should have unlimited access to an internet. Is it inconvenient? Yeah, just like cutting your hand off would be. And by the way, you do know he doesn't mean break out the buzzsaw. No. But there are some times you got to say, I'm going to have to go without in order to have life and joy, right? So guard your mind by what goes into it. Guard your heart. Don't sell yourself cheap to anybody. So God created sex to be valued. And finally, God created sex to be a promise. In verse 16, the bride speaks and she responds to her lover's invitation. And in everything she says, she's valuing herself. She's got respect for herself as created in the image of God. This is her wedding night. This is what she's waited for. That there's a wholehearted embracing of sexual intimacy. There's a reckless abandonment and fun in this. It's something just vibrant and alive and beautiful. And because it's in a covenant, there's no comparisons. There's no competition. There's no waking up the next morning in fear of being alone. So what we see in this passage is these three things. God created sex to be beautiful. He created it to be valued. He created it as a promise. Some closing reflections. For those of us who are virgins, value that. Don't apologize for it. It's something to be valued. It's something to be revered. It's something to honor God through. Don't give in to the pressure of people and the culture around you to the idol of sex. Replace the idol with something else. Being effective as a Christian in the world means that we replace the things that are against the kingdom and corrosive to our hearts and minds with things that are beautiful. And people are starving for beauty, and they need to see that. Know that you're loved already and cherished as a beloved son or daughter. Know that you can enjoy being a male or a female without being sexually active. For those of you who have made mistakes, those of us who have fallen, and that's everybody in this room because we're in a fallen world, know that you're in good company. Know that we're all struggling with all kinds of things. We need grace for each other. For instance, statistics say that 30% of the Christian men in this sanctuary are deeply involved in pornography, to the point where it's a controlling problem. Sadly, the highest viewing day for pornography among Christian men is Sunday. And you can kind of guess at the reasons for all that. What I want to say to those of us who are struggling with pornography is shame grows best in darkness. When it's brought out into the light, you'd be surprised how many of your brothers are going through exactly the same things. But we can't talk about it because this is church. We value our reputations too highly, and we don't want to be outcast in it. That's got to change, guys, and girls too, to some extent. Somewhere we got to man up and have the strength and the manliness to help each other through this, because we're going through it. It's our great enemy. It helps to talk. It brings healing. It brings freedom. It brings life. For those of us who are struggling with same-sex desires, know that sex doesn't define you. If you've got homosexual drives in you, know that those drives don't define you any more than heterosexual drives define a heterosexual. We're all in this together. We're all broken. We've all been damaged. We live in a fallen world. There are issues, but we can help each other. For those of you who are married, cultivate the sexual dimension of your life by talking about it. It's the least talked about thing in marriage. And there's fear. Well, if we talk about it, things will get worse. If we talk about it, I'll find out things I don't want to know. Well, how's it working? By not talking about it. Much better. Monotony is just great, when it comes to not communicating. Again, this takes courage. It takes all of us to encourage each other in this. Learn how to talk about sexuality. For parents, talk to your kids at the earliest ages that's appropriate about sexuality. Be God to them. Let them know that there's joy, fun, life in this for them. Build into their hearts a sense of gratitude about their sexuality so that there's not guilt about it. Again, if you don't talk about it, it's the same as saying there's something shameful, right? For those of us who have been wounded in disappointed, struggling in our marriages, wishing we had married somebody else, wishing things had worked out differently if our marriages have ended. Know that this is an area where we can comfort each other as a family. Know that for young people, there are older people in this place who would love to mentor you, pray with you, talk with you. This is where we are a family. This is where we are salt and light. This is where we become not only a safe place, but an open place that invites other people in. Know that there's healing. We have a marriage retreat this Saturday, February 11th. This isn't for winners. This isn't for people who've got perfect marriages any more than Jesus came for those who didn't need healing. He came for those who do, and for those who want to strengthen their marriage. As Christians, let the world know that sex and love are connected in God. You can say those things in the same breath. God, sex, and love. He's put them together. People are hungering for beauty. This is a very crass world we live in, isn't it? It's a harsh and cold place. It's brutal in its treatment of sex. There is no beauty in it. But there can be in the church. And people are hungering for beauty. God created sex to be beautiful, valued, and promised. But there is yet one more thing in closing. Matthew 22, Jesus is confronted about marriage in the afterlife. Pharisees are trying to trick him with a question about who are you going to be married to in heaven? And he says this in verse 29 of Matthew 22. Your mistake is that you don't know the Scriptures, and you don't know the power of God. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels. And then he goes on to say that God is a God of the living, not of the dead. Now, some people have looked at this and said, oh gosh, that stinks. I want to be married in heaven. I love my wife and my husband. I can't imagine being separated from them. This isn't separation. This is the ultimate marriage, married to the Son of God. This is the great wedding feast, not for sex, because it's transcended. That's why there's no marriage. There's no need. You're not going to want to be married. We're going to have the closest, most beautiful, satisfying, thrilling unity in a marriage as a husband and wife in the great wedding feast. That's what this table reminds us of. That's why we actually have real things like bread and wine. It's a celebration of what's to come. We're going to be married to Jesus Christ. Sex and love and marriage are just a shadow of things to come. That's why you can't ultimately fulfill all of your needs. Right? So when we raise up as Christians marriage to the level of an idol, we're not helping anybody. Because nobody can be the fulfillment of all your loves and dreams except for the bridegroom. And that's what's going to happen someday. Something so beautiful, so wonderful we can't even imagine it. God of the living, not of the dead, the great wedding,